Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dion, and I'm a researcher from the Center for Livable Cities. I will be your MC for today's lecture. The center was jointly established by the Ministry of National Development and the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources in 2008 to distill, create, and share knowledge on livable and sustainable cities. The CLC lecture is one of the platforms through which urban thought leaders share best practices and exchange ideas and experiences. Today, we have the honor of having Dr. Seek Ngee Huat to share his experiences in pursuing a public-private partnership in real estate from his private sector point of view. Dr. Seek is chairman of the Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies at NUS, where he is also a practice professor of real estate. He is chairman of GLP-IM Holdings Limited and a board member of Brookfield Asset Management Inc. Canada, as well as the Center for Livable Cities. He is also senior advisor to Fraser's Property Limited and the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board. He was also previously the chairman of Global Logistic Properties Limited, chairman of ULI Asia Pacific, president of GIC Real Estate, and board member of GIC Private Limited. Before GIC, he was a senior partner at Jones Lang Wootton in Sydney. According to a CLC expert whom I work with closely, and some of you might know him, Mr. Choi Chanpong, Dr. Seek's former role as president of GIC Real Estate is the job that, according to him, he would give up his right arm and right leg for. I replied that it is a job that I'll give up all my limbs for. So he was outbidden. And evidently, as we can see today, Dr. Seek is here with all his limbs, didn't lose any along the way. And yeah, we'll be very happy, and it is our honor to have him here with us. Jokes aside, in this lecture, Dr. Seek will share more about the Singapore Government Land Sales Program, or GLS for short, and how it has been a key enabler in real estate PPP projects, and how this GLS in particular has evolved to give developers flexibility in determining the concepts and the use mix of the developments. The focus of the lecture would be a cross-examination of the GLS with international case examples that Dr. Seek is very familiar with, and how the government can continue to share more risk with developers in real estate PPP projects. The format for today's lecture will start off with a presentation by Dr. Seek, followed by a Q&A session with the audience. The lecture will be moderated by none other than Mr. Sin Lai Chong, who is the Group Director of Land Sales and Administration Group of the Urban Redevelopment Authority. We would like to encourage the audience to kindly hold all Q&A till the end. With this, let us start the session by inviting Dr. Seek on stage. Dr. Seek, please.
Yeah, okay, well, thank you very much for, let me have this, the showing up this afternoon. I hope we haven't misled you, because when I noticed when the first flyer, the e-flyer went out, there was no mention of real estate. It was just urban development, and it's common to associate PPP with infrastructure projects. I don't know anything about infrastructure projects, so this talk is about real estate, and maybe that explains why there's so many of you here. But before I start, I really want to acknowledge Sin Tian Fu and his team at the Institute of Real Estate and Urban Studies at NUS for helping me pulling this together, and the strong support from CLC. So this is a joint project. I'm only the mouthpiece. So, right. This just started with this. This talk is about PPP, as I said, and the PPP model has been, how it's been used in Singapore. Basically, I will start out by giving you a historical perspective of how the GLS program has evolved over time. And I'm a little bit hesitant about this now that I noticed that there are a lot of experienced people who have been with URA for a long time, including Mr. Alan Cho. So I hope my facts are right. Otherwise, the CLC's got partly to be blamed because they checked the slides. So how the program has evolved over time, what can we learn from these? And then compare our PPP models with those overseas, and then the learning points from the comparison. And finally, I would touch on the challenges and some of the opportunities. Just raise some questions. So before we get into the nitty-gritty, I thought it would be useful to take a step back and have a look at the broader perspective of what it was like. Now, you're looking back since Singapore's independence, it is clear that the symbiotic relationship between the public and private sectors is a key success factor in transforming Singapore from what was then, in '65, a poor third world city to a world-class metropolis. In fact, this was one of the main findings in the book that my colleagues, two of my colleagues at NUS and I put together. And I'd like to show you the quote that sort of summarizes how we got here. Our way of doing PPP may not be standard around the world, but it certainly works. Now, the other reason for showing this book is, unfortunately, we didn't bring any books here to sell. To say that the Chinese translation of this book, the Chinese are interested, will be ready by the end of the year. And then I was told that the Koreans are interested in translating it. So you can see that Singapore does have a bit of influence around the world. So on that, let me move on. That in the, so in a general sense, you can say uniquely Singaporean, it has been a giant PPP, right? And that, which got us to where we are today. But it is worth noting that during this phase of development in Singapore, perhaps for good reasons, the public sector has been the dominant partner. Now, I'll come more to it later on, and it's really clear. So let's look at the government. We identify 5 major roles that our government plays. The first 3 are not unusual. Policymakers, providers. The reason I'm standing here is because it's too dark. I cannot see what I've written. So the policymakers, a provider of soft and hard infrastructure and regulator, that's common, right? You see this everywhere in the world. So you can see, this slide gives you a shot of the number of government agencies involved in urban development. That's all. And the last two being what is unique is that the government here takes on the role as an active participant in real estate development. Firstly, as the largest landowner who controls the release of land for development purposes. And secondly, the largest housing developer responsible for 80% of the population's housing. So those things are very unique and make it in a very powerful position, which it has used very well. So it is the supply of sites for development purposes that is the main subject of today's talk. The sales, methods and conditions, pricing, risk and profit sharing, degree of private participation, and so on are some of the things I'm going to touch on as we go through it. Now, first, let's just look at the next thing is that the public sector has been administering the supply of land through the GLS program. That's the Government Land Sales Program, we know that. But that has been evolving over the years. In essence, The changes made is about giving more flexibility to the private sector, right? To decide what they can build on the site. So perhaps partly a result of learning from its past experience, and partly in response to a changing property market. Now, in the early days, the sales of sites are very straightforward. They are not much the buyer of the land could do. They just go ahead and build according to instructions, right? From the URD then. Then in subsequent years, more flexibilities were given. The white sites, first of all, to allow the developer to more flexibility to decide on the use of land. And then we move on to 2 envelope, which is giving more emphasis to design and concept. And so I think we all know about the 2 envelope system. The first is to base the competition on design and concept, and then the winners, the selected winners, get into the second stage, and that was decided on price. So we'll talk a bit more about this. But it is important also to note that while this is happening, the real estate market has also been changing with increasing capital and sophistication. So in the early days, they were all undercapitalized developers. The local developers were very undercapitalized. They were housing developers. So, and then when they moved to commercial development, the way to recycle their capital property is to sell the strata title units. That's how we all started. And then things started to improve. We have public company, we are more integrated, become more integrated with the capital markets. And now we also have REITs. At the same time, real estate markets around the world are being globalized. And there's a much bigger pool of capital, institutional capital, long-term capital. They are seeking out long-term investments. So that we have to learn to harness more. So those are things. Now, I don't want to cover too much about the URA. I think most people here will know the role of URA very well. But just to give it some historical perspective, that in the early days, that many of you are probably much, much younger than me here, will probably not appreciate that the URA actually did a tremendous job in the urban renewal of Singapore. But without the kind of regulations or the empowerment by the regulations such as the Compulsory Land Acquisition Act and the Control Act, it will be very hard to clear slums and assemble lands together to allow development to happen. So just as a statistic, which I hope is correct, that a total of 46 sites between 1967 and 69 were tendered out. You can see how gung-ho the government was in those days. 46 sites in 3 years, probably 2.5. And that was basically in executing the urban renewal program. Mr. Cho can confirm that, probably. But the thing to note that, so those sites resulted in a number of commercial developments which have already gone through a second cycle. You look at the number of office buildings that were along Shenton Ways, and many of them are gone, replaced by new ones. And we are talking about redeveloping those in what was called the Golden Miles along beach roads. So they were already going through that cycle. So the GLS is the main, as I said, the program, and we look at how it has evolved over time, and I want to do that quite quickly first. So the purpose, as we know, of this program is to sell state land to the private sector on a price competitive basis. This has not changed. What has changed are the terms and conditions of the sites, qualifying criteria, tendering mechanism, and degree of private participation allowed. So basically, the URA instituted this process, and in the PPP language, they are really the counterparty to the private sector, the private developer. Right? And of course, the development is all subject to the rules and regulations of the URA. So they're really straightforward, very straightforward land sales, not much of a partnership as such, that they were mostly small single-use sites. And basically, the developer bought the site according to the terms and built according to the terms and conditions stipulated by the URD. No flexibility allowed for a change of use, nor any explicit mechanism for risk sharing. However, there's one little known fact, and I only learned it when I had a chat with Khoo Chai. And that was that, in fact, in the first 10 years or so, the government, the winner of the tenders were allowed to pay the land over 10 years with installments. Right? Now, in this sense, there's some help, some sharing of risk in that sense. And because recognizing that the developers of those days really didn't have the depth of capital to take on to build. And it is a way to incentivize them to bid for the land and put their capital to build the development, take some risks. So in that sense, even in the early days, there was some convergence of objectives with the private sector. So on the part of the government, the site was sold and developed, and thereby achieving its urban renewal objectives. Whereas as far as the private sector developers are concerned, they achieve its profit motive when they sold out what they built or leased them out. But I would say that it is questionable, in fact, if these early developments achieve the longer-term objectives, because I would say that many of these first-generation buildings were of dubious quality, and many were built to be sold off as strata title units, and they're not really for long-term hold. Developers have a much shorter, in those days, shorter time horizon, if you like, than the public sector in those days. So there was really a diversion of that. They didn't have enough, understandably in those days, developers didn't have the deep pockets that some of them have here. So they had to recycle their capital. Yes, the two envelopes and the white side. As I said earlier on, the white side is really to give flexibility for developers to decide what's best, what's the optimal use for them, in the belief that they understand the market and they can respond to the market. They're more in tune with the market. So that's one thing. So in some sense, you can say, if you look at the white sides and after the two envelopes saying, the buildings that were built certainly seem to have much higher quality and probably higher longevity. The two envelope system is really introduced to give more emphasis to design as a long-term objective, which is an important long-term objective from the point of the public sector. But the question often raised on this is that if design is deemed so important, why is the second envelope based strictly on price? So you can end up selecting the highest price with the worst design in the second stage. The other thing that I often heard about this is that I'm sure the selection process is rigorous, but ultimately design aesthetics tend to be somewhat subjective and can be controversial. So those are the kind of risks that one has to take. Then I then want to move on to this so-called large-scale development. This gave developers even more discretion to decide on the optimal mix in response to market demands and phasing, and there has also explicit risk sharing was introduced for the first time in Singapore. So we'll look at two projects, Suntech and MBFC. Many of you know, I'm sure, know these two projects. They have interesting similarities and also differences. By Singapore standard, these sites are considered very large. And they, at that time, were seen to be carrying much higher risks, at least from the perspective of the developers and also the government, I guess, the private sector. Both are sold, or both were sold on the basis of the highest tender price and not a two-envelope system. But, as I say, the MBFC has an option payment scheme to share risk. Now, it's worth noting that someone will first thing come to mind is the IR. The IR, I understand, is under a different system, where it is fixed price and selection is based on the best proposal put forward. More details, I guess there will be more people here who are more able to answer that than me. So some fact sheets on Suntech and MBFC. I think I don't need to go to a lot of details. You've seen the buildings and you know where it is. But the important thing to note just is that what was the development objective? And that was the first one. Suntech was to anchor Singapore's position as an international exhibition and convention hub, right? And all the rest, the number of square footage and so on, I think, you know, it was only bought for $208 million. Then as for Marina Bay, it's smaller site actually than, that the objective there was to enhance Singapore's competitiveness as a financial center. I think that was a recognition that the financial world was changing. This point will come back when I look at Canary Wharf later on, of large floor space. And that was an attempt to encourage developers to build large buildings. So let me just now go through some of the a review of the GLS system and share with you some of my thoughts. The scenes are entirely mine, this one. So as far as market timing is concerned, let me find the right one. Yes. The Suntech was bought by a consortium of 11 Hong Kong tycoons. And the rumor had it that Mr. Lee Kuan Yew had to persuade them personally. Right? MBFC were bought by a consortium of 2 Hong Kong companies and Capitaland. Both were sold under very depressed market conditions. That's common between the two. Now, the problem is if you choose to sell under those circumstances, you tend not to be able to get a very good price, what we call undervaluation. That's one. Secondly, if you are selling them and really want developers to take on the job quickly, you as a public sector might have to compromise on design principles for commercial realities or expediency. So those are the things that why timing can be important. Then on alignment of interests, this is a picture, somebody dig it out, of the 11 tycoons from Hong Kong that bought it. Right? Then on alignments of interests, I think it's fair to say that both projects met the hard objectives. We got our financial center. We got our financial, our big buildings that have been now housing a lot of finance-related company. And for Suntech, we got our convention center, even though now we have an even bigger convention center. But in those days, yes, we did in that sense. But there seemed to be a mismatching of time horizons, as I said. that is short-term profit gains versus long-term objective. Suntech offices were sold very quickly as strata title. Right? And when you have a consortium of Hong Kong developers, you could see that turning around and getting the return quickly is their main objective. So we can see why that happened. As far as capital and as far as MBFC is concerned, Capital also sold, as you can see, they have 1/3 share in 2 chunks to a REIT, to Capital REIT. But this is slightly different because the remaining consortium members, which are Chong and Hong Kong Land, and K-REITs, are more like long-term investors. Okay, that's the difference. Now let me move to planning and urban design. I'm in dangerous territory, I know. Many of you are in that area. But shoot me later on, not now. You could just hear me out. Okay? So I think it's clear that large-scale development has greater impact on the built environment. So this is important. Urban design is important. So now, first of all, I think we can say that there is a lack of complementary users. So developers, in both cases, chose not to have hotels. I mean, why do you build a convention center when there's no hotel? The reason is very obvious, that the developers didn't see that as a quick way to turn around for Suntech. And the hotels were actually in the Suntech, and it was not part of the original scheme. They were built subsequently, I think subsequently, right? Am I right? Or at the same time? Pan Pacific, Marina South, that area. Then as far as MBFC is concerned, again, it wasn't included. So that was one. Also, I think there's some criticism about the 2 developments are not pedestrian friendly. There is really no, what we would call street level vibrancy. Right? There wasn't at the time a sense of placemaking, in both sides. And if you look at MFC, it's much more well connected, more open space, and yet no vibrancy on the street. So maybe it is because it's incomplete yet. I see still bits and pieces of raw land around. So maybe, as somebody said, the 2 envelope system could have overcome some of these issues. Then on marketing, I better check. The marketing side, I believe MBFC was the first time we took on and did if I could put a proper marketing to the world. I think this is important. This is a good thing. And then we end up having 9 bids, I think, and they're quite serious bids, even though it was the market wasn't very favorable for, right? So yes, I think a well-orchestrated global marketing campaign is really very useful. This is especially now, because there's so much long-term capital sitting around waiting to be attracted. I think that's something that we can do more for future projects. Risk and profit sharing. Okay, this is something which I have some more personal experiences. You see, don't forget, a developer is motivated by the prospect of profits versus risk, right? Or in investment terms, as expected returns adjusted for risk. That's how we look at things like that. So the higher the expected risk, the higher the expected returns. That's the way the commercial world works on any projects of business nature. So risk mitigation is a very key part of any investor's due diligence, right? To really determine the price you can afford to pay. And in order to achieve your expected return. Now, so any risk mitigants will improve the desirability of the land, and so a willingness to bid at a higher price. So this includes like reduced uncertainties, right? Cost sharing, risk sharing. So, for example, the assurance from the government to limit the release of new land supply in both Suntech and MBFC is a way to reduce uncertainties. The use of option pricing in MBFC is another way to, it's a form of risk sharing and reduce the uncertainty as well. This is an important thing, the option pricing, because a lot of developers, when they take on a site, a greenfield site, most of the time, the land around it is also not developed. So when they take the risk to develop the site, and if they are successful, they will enhance the value of everything around it. So if, therefore, they want to buy the next piece, they have to pay the market price, the enhanced value then. So developers, the option pricing allows the developer to enjoy, to share some of that profit, the enhancement of the surrounding pieces. So some of you, many of you will know Xintiandi in Shanghai. The risk was enormous to do a job, something like that in China in those days. Sui On took on this thing. They made it successful. They enhanced the value of everything around it, and they had the result had to pay more. But they were still early enough to buy them and later on still make a lot of profits. But that was one of the bugbears, if you like. So the other thing is the MBFCs has a residential component which could be sold off quickly. And that also helps the developer to reduce his risk, right? Because there's more cash flow coming in the early days. Now, the other thing is profit sharing. We don't use profit sharing in Singapore. Whereas a lot of other places, profit sharing is used. And it is a very good way to align interests, long-term interests, because you have a share of the revenue or the profit in a back-ended sense. So to ensure that the project is built according to your long-term objectives. So back-ended could be a share of revenue, as I say, after a certain level, or returns after a certain level. So all kinds of permutations you can do. Then the last thing is master developer model, which there are two areas being mooted, Kampong Bugis and the Jurong Lake District. Not a lot of details out there, but my understanding of this is that you have, this is, yes, this Bugis and Jurong Lake District, there are two of them. I don't want to go through it because I think it's still been evolved. It's still evolving, if I'm not wrong, and that there's not a lot of details. But it is really conceptually a way to shift more of the responsibilities and the doing of developing the site to a private developer, right? And the question here is that, as we know, it's always a matching of social and policy needs versus the private sector's level of profitability. So the question is, what is the balance? Is the master developed site a good way to do it, to do that, or are we swinging a little bit too far to the other side? Should there be a better way, better aligned, if the master developer is a single purpose statutory authority? I think a little bit like Sentosa. If you have a large, big enough site, so something that it's worth thinking about. And this model is common around the world, of having a single purpose authority to really manage, be the master developer to manage the development over time. And don't forget, many of these developments go for a long duration of 20 or 30 years. These three projects are chosen because I have some personal involvement in them. I told you about Melbourne Docklands, why it's chosen, and I'll be very brief on Melbourne Docklands. Canary Wharf is now controlled by Brookfield, where I sit on where I'm a board member. So I had good access to it, and George Eberbescu and his team has been very helpful in providing information. And U10 is a project done by Wan Ke in Shenzhen, and they gave me a conducted tour a couple of months ago, so I had some personal. I was suitably impressed with what they were trying to do. So let me just move on quickly to so Melbourne Docklands, right? It's a huge site, and that and it was just a derelict piece of work at the fringe of the CBD at one end of the commercial center, and that the thing is that when we were appointed as consultant, the CEO was very insistent that he didn't want another land use master plan. He wanted a strategic business plan. Right? So that was his instruction, and that was what we did. And he wanted one that was executable quickly. And you can see why, because the government was not going to support it. There was no money, right? And all the funding has to be internally funded. So the result of which is, and this was not my work, we took it from somebody else, to say that the first decade was very much commercially driven, right? And so again, we had the result that there was no sense of community in the first 10 years. But 2010 onwards, that started to, I guess the community started to be concerned, and there will be more emphasis on more community-related oriented development and provisions of community infrastructure, open space, and so on. I think for those of you who have seen it recently, you will understand what this means, right? It's all very nice, but there was just, somebody said, there was just no life. Then we go to Canary Wharf, which the reason I picked it is all because it's got a 30 years of history, and it went through a lot of ups and downs, and there are a lot of learning lessons we can get from Canary Wharf. So I wanted to just say that Canary Wharf was really another derelict rundown places that the UK central government, the Thatcher year, wanted to revive, and it became an enterprise zone, which means it gets tax concession. So ONY here acquired the site in 1988. I'm cutting out a lot of stories there. ONY bought it in 1986 to do this construction, began in 88. Unfortunately, when the large amount of safe space became available in the first phase, 4.5 million square meters, it coincided with a huge property slums. The result of which was ONY went bust, right? And that it was taken over later on by Canary Wharf, and then Canary Wharf Limited. It's now a JV between two groups, but Brookfield runs this. And now it's a thriving employment and what do you call that, retail hub. So, now, what is very important, I think a very important point to note, and I alluded to it earlier on, and that is, why did Paul Reitman of ONY, Olympia in New York, took on such a big risk? And that was because he saw what was happening in Wall Street, that the whole trading system has changed. Now, the financial banks and so on need very large trading space and also extensive use of computers, right? And redundancy power. So they figured that by then, this movement will move to London. And indeed, London government took all this, and they had this big bang. Some of you may or may not remember. So the demand was there. all right? But the thing to note here is that, unfortunately, Paul didn't have the depth of capital to hold it. And when there was a huge hiccup in 1991, 92, he couldn't hold. Then whoever bought it then profited from it and built on it. So that, as you can see, this thing has been going on for a long time. So let me show you, this was what it was like in 1980. This is where we get information from. It was really nothing. 1985, okay, the DLR is the Dockland Light Rail. When I went there in the early 1980s, 1980s, that was only the light rail running. And I looked at this thing, and there were all these big buildings were coming out, and that was the only way to commute. I call it a toy train. And it looked like a toy train. The problem was the Jubilee line extension, which is the subway station that connects to bring people to Docklands, wasn't built as promised by the government, and that was one of the contributory factor to the problem that Paul Reitman encountered. It was in 1998, almost 10 years later, that it got built. And now, 2004, you can see the working population is 15,000, 1 million square feet, and 2018, 120,000, and 2025, they expect 200,000. And don't forget, the Crossrail is being built, and in fact, one of the things they did was very smart. They offered to build the station, the Canary Wharf station for the Crossrail for the government, and on top of it, they built a huge shopping center. So you can see that they're very proactive. I think I've said some of these, so we can skip the reasons for the failures and so on. Basically, the failure was due to the government not being able to commit to deliver on the transportation needs. And secondly is that the developers just didn't have that capital to hold. And then on the plus side, I think you know the reason. So I took this quote from George Icobescu. I think you remember when we were looking at MBFC, he came around. He was one of the people that was consulted. And he has been very nice. So this quote basically say what is needed for a PPP, right? If I can read it, in a public-private partnership, the most important thing is to get the incentives and objectives aligned. The public sector must get the best result when the private sector is successful and vice versa. So whether it is on the basis of sharing profits, reducing costs, or creating jobs, a good PPP is a win-win for both parties. I mean, it's really what it is, right? So let me go to Yitan, right? It was really, during the days when Shenzhen was developing very rapidly, the farmers, what was then urban fringe, were building all these, what I would call them, walk-up apartment blocks, really substandard stuff that they were building, and hardly any amenities. The alleyways between the buildings were so narrow, you can almost touch it from one to the other. So what's happening is that these locations is now becoming pretty prime as the city expanded. So Wanke, I mean, this is what they call Chenzhongchun, the village in the city project, which has been encouraged by the government. And Wanke is a private developer, took it upon themselves. This is their own initiative to basically did a master lease with the farmers, upgraded them, and then rent them out, right? Now, the interesting thing is when I visited this site was that they were converted as what we currently call them co-living space. So they upgraded the whole thing, better thing, and then they, in these places, they created a lot more, I guess, common areas, more interactive stays for young people, and it's intended for young people. interestingly enough, one could assign a young group of employees to take charge of this project. And they know what the younger people want. Another interesting thing I found out was there was no paperwork. All the administrative process of renting was all through an app. They designed an app to do this. That was how the whole thing has become quite different from the way I think it was done. So what they did was they changed some of the facade, make it some cheerful colors like this. And this is a comparison of what it was before. I won't go into a lot of detail, no time. And this was how they changed it. This on the right-hand side, the extreme right-hand side at the top, is a show of, see, these buildings are all of different heights, 5 stories, 6 stories, 7 stories, and so on. They connected them out with staircase linking them out. So these rooftops of different levels become very interesting, and they could be used for common interaction, for purposes. So I think it has worked very well. And it actually provided a need for the city and upgraded what was a blighted area. So I actually would call this an impact investment, which means to say that you're actually providing a social service and yet get a modest return. These are some of the facts. I don't think we need to know that. Now, I just want to go through it, some of the learning points, right, of by making this comparison. The first one is what private participation. That and what are the learning points we get by looking at the overseas cases? Certainly, the overseas cases have a much higher level of private participation. So the private sector is both more willing and able to take initiatives. Right? In the case of Canary Wharf, they actually proactively contributed to the building of the stations as well as contributing to Jubilee line. In the case of One Ke, was entirely the initiative. Right? Singapore, however, our style is we tend to be more prescriptive in approach. Maybe there was a deep mistrust of private developers. So Singapore, to tap on the, if you like, the innovative ideas and innovations from the private sector, I think more latitude had to be given to them, and there had to be an improved level of trust. So maybe the master plan approach is a way to do it. And I also see that recently I read in a newspaper this called business improvement districts, where the government contribute money to get the private business to work together. It's another sign that we are moving in the right direction. The next thing is choice of partners. I think this is pretty clear. We want partners to have strong financial resources and shared long-term values. And so as I mentioned before, the consortium of Hong Kong tycoons is not necessarily the best choice for a long-term project. And ONY wasn't the right group because it didn't have the financial muscle for such a long project that could go through these kind of huge problems. They have ambition, but they don't have the depth of capital. Alignment of interests. So as I said, they are motivated by profits, but we have to bear in mind that not all developers are about short-term gains. I think that is an important thing to remember, because you look at Canary Wharf, it is a good example of long-term strategies that it has pursued for a long time. It's been there for 30 years and still there, and still developing the place. In fact, I took a quote from Michael Koh. It's not easy to satisfy Michael Koh about urban designs. And when he compared the MBFC to Canary Wharf, and that was what he said, that it was more interesting. In other words, the developers actually put some thought into it to make the place interesting. There's more greater sense of placemaking too. Right? I won't read him. I don't know whether Michael is here. So the other thing is reliability and delivery. I think we went through that. I won't talk about it. The other thing is, you have to set realistic targets. The Canary Wharf case is a very good example that there was a fixed date that they must build 4.5 million square meter by 1991. There was no flexibility. And so there must be some built-in flexibility, or the period of time given had to be more than reasonable. And I think in the two cases of Suntech and MBFC, I think we were probably, maybe in the Suntech side, was not as reasonable as MBFC. It was 10 years and 18 years. Right? So, yeah, cooperation and interaction throughout the project durations. I think it is important, obviously, in any long-term project, like going through a lot of twists and turns, ups and downs, there must be continuous cooperation, interaction between the private sector and the private developer. And that was the great thing about Canary Wharf that George has been able to do all these years. And regulatory transparency, we know. I think it's very good for participants in these projects to know exactly what they can do and what they can't do, and to move on. And then the last thing is that Singapore Inc. has some unique strengths, and that these strengths are actually essential ingredients for a successful PPP, and which private partners in other jurisdictions can only wish for. Right? The first one is that it is the largest landowner. It's good and bad, but I think generally good because you can control the supply of land. And you have used it well in cases where you need to, in Suntech and MBFC, right? So you can turn on and off the switch, which is a great thing to have. But of course, the great burden is, do you know when to turn it off and turn it on? And that's not so easy. Sometimes it's very hard to play God. So the other thing that we often forget is it's a one-tier government. Most jurisdictions have 3 tiers. I got 3 minutes. 3 tiers, 3 minutes. And that it caused all kinds of political strife between the different governments. I won't tell you a story about Canary Wharf, but later on we can talk about it. And of course, we have a very competent, reliable, efficient public service. And that's important that we know whatever we say, the public sector say they would do, they would deliver. I think that is something that is very hard to get. So I just want to quickly cover the future challenges now, that what do we have to do? That the first thing is, I think in the Singapore context, we need to foster greater private participation. And we are so good, right, at what we are doing in the public sector, and so dominant. When we ask the question, is sometimes, it becomes a negative when you're too good at something. So it may run the risk of actually suffocating or stifling new ideas and new ideas and innovations from the private sector. Don't even give them a chance to do that. So also the other thing I said earlier on, that the developers are very different from the early days when we developed all these schemes. They are much more sophisticated, they're much more well capitalized, and they have seen the world. They have invested overseas, and then we have overseas investors looking at us, a huge pool of capital now. The other thing is the public sector is good at a lot of things, but it's not good at everything. It's not really good at harnessing market forces. Right? It's not good at, I won't say it's not good, I should say that it's not really their forte. Public servants are not appointed to deliver on those things, those expectations. The private sector, on the other hand, brings with it market knowledge, entrepreneurship, not to mention capital and a willingness to take risks. The question is, in Singapore, whether the public sector can genuinely step back to allow a much higher level of private participation. It probably requires a change of culture or mindset, and perhaps to increase the level of trust in the private developed sectors. So it means enabling the private sector to be more involved in more upstream decision making. And then we see some of the projects that probably are not doing quite as well, like One North. Would the public sector have made a difference if they had been involved in the right upstream? Okay, so I want to go to demographics and these things. Demographics, I just wanted to say that looking ahead for Singapore, I think there are a lot of opportunities for more private participation. One of them is our changing demographics. We have an aging population, we have a falling birth rate. We will need more health facilities and more welfare services. So that's one change. The other thing is we have a new group of people that have overtaken people in our generation, the baby boomers. They are called the millennials. They have a different outlook on life. They have different lifestyle change that they want. So maybe, and I would think that in the next 20 or 30 years, the millennials are going to determine the type of real estate we produce. So in both cases, there are both challenges and opportunity for greater participation from the private sector. Just to mention a few ideas to illustrate this point, building up healthcare facilities, for example, has always been a public sector domain, right? And, but I think we should allow private sectors to play a better role. I mean, I was shown Kampong Admiralty. It was entirely a public sector initiative to build smaller units for older people and in a complex, integrated with healthcare services, shoppings, and a lot of other, including childcare. Now, why shouldn't the private sector be involved? The only deterrent in Singapore is the high land cost. So, can this kind of project be done on a BOT basis where the land is free? And private sector BOT means build, operate, and transfer. That people, qualified operators, could take on this kind of role. The other thing is that for millennials, for example, maybe we need to provide greater housing choices. As the One Curve project, I've kind of learned from that with falling population, with aging population, at some point in the future, we are going to have excess public housing, obsolete or excess housing. Can we not invite the public sector, the private sector to come in to convert some of these public housing and turn them into co-living space for the young people? And think of it, if Singapore can be a hub to, I guess, attract talented young people, affordable housing is something they want. And we know all the millennials in the world, in the big cities, they all want to live in the city center or close to the city center. And at a certain stage of their life, they don't mind co-living. In fact, they love that. So there's some opportunities here that we can think of to do it. So now the other two, I don't really want to say a lot. I think there are a lot of people who have much more knowledge than me about relocation of government resources. What it says is that, and remember our government has warned us that they're going to raise taxes because more money is going to spend on welfare and other kind of amenities. So what it means is that it's an opportunity to dip in the private sector pocket to participate in some of these projects that we more impact investments and other profitable organizations that they can get. And the last one is new technology. I'm sure most of you know much more about that than me. But the one thing I want to say is that the private sector is probably more in tune with the technology changes, the technological changes, and in applications. So there is certainly more room giving the private sector the leading role in a partnership in certain kind of big businesses, whether it is smart city technologies, energy, all kind of new areas that we are in. Thank you. I know I ran over time, but I was trying to go very fast at the end.
Thank you, Dr. Sid, for your talk. It's given us a lot of food for thought, including myself. I've been involved in GRS for a long time. Maybe I'll start the ball rolling with a question, partly for personal benefit as well. You talked a lot about GRS, how it evolved over the years and so on, and how there's room for improvement. So I'm really curious to hear from you if there's one thing that you think is that you could change and it's important to change for the GRS system and the program and how it's run. What would that one key improvement be for GRS?
Make the price cheap. No, sorry, that's I think that's not possible, given our system. I think my central point is that if you look at the way we have evolved over time, right? Singapore land development sales programs, I think we need more input from the private sector, both from the point of view of leverage of their, not just their capital, which is important, right? But also new ideas. That now we are a different world from what it used to be 20, 30 years ago. And that will be, if we continue the way of not letting go, we are not going to be able to leverage off that area. That's the central point that I'm trying to make. But I think it's easier said than done, because I suspect culturally this is not so easy to do, right? Given how our society and how our government system has moved along over the years. But at the same time, I think the government is probably recognizing this, and I gave the example of the Business Improvement District, that they are quite happy to contribute public sector money to encourage the private sector to do. And the other thing is, of course, that we tend to think about public-private partnership in big hundreds of $1 million projects. It doesn't have to be. This is one example, and there are others, like healthcare facilities, for example. It doesn't have to be hundreds of millions of dollars. It doesn't have to be another MBFC or the IR.
Okay, now I'll open it to the audience for questions. If you could just state your name and perhaps which organization you're from before you ask your question. Okay, the first question, please. Yeah.
Too many questions, but I will refrain myself to say a few comments for Dr. Seek to give us some responses. Sorry, I'm sitting down. Your first remark, I'm not going to shoot the messenger, but this is a clear message to the other people who may be misreading your message. In architecture and urban design, one of the most dominant affirmation of a signature project is creating controversy around it. Good or bad or ugly or all the above.
Okay.
Earlier you talked about aesthetic being subjective. Not quite. Anyway, that's my personal opinion, so you think about it. Secondly is, I think you mentioned about the street level activity of Suntech and MBFC, right? But to be fair to URA and the developer, the subterranean strata is thriving very well. For a reason that our hot and humid climate is not very conducive to walk around midday, but you go down to that level, it's a beehive, okay? Third comment, healthcare. If only it's as simple as your suggestion to get some private sector participation in the healthcare facility, because healthcare in itself is very complex. And in healthcare, if I'm not mistaken, in Singapore, you involve many ministries, PMO, MOM, MND, MOE, MOH, of course, beside others. So to try to tweak the existing balance, you may face a problem of not being able to meet our healthcare needs with 4% of GDP. It probably go to double digit like the US or the UK, Australia, or even Canada, right? So your comments, please, Dr. Seet. Thank you.
Let's start from the last one. I actually didn't get the first question. So you will help me. He can hear better than me. That's the problem when I got getting a bit of problem with hearing. It's okay. I think I have someone here who can hear. But on healthcare, I'm not suggesting it's easy at all, you know. But I think if we think it's difficult and don't try, that's the end of it. It will forever be like that. I think there are opportunities, and in fact, if you look at you don't have to go through a lot of healthcare in the intricacy of it. Just look at, for example, senior housing or assisted living, right? Other parts of the world, they can do it. The private sector can get involved, and there are different grades. That's the advantage of it, that they can provide different kind of housing. And then the public sector can take on whatever that is not really viable for the private sector to do. That's all I'm saying, that we should be open-minded about it. See, Kampong MRT, I was very, very impressed with what they have done. Now, it looks like it's working, right? But why can't the private sector do it if they don't have to pay for the land? Right? So the second question was, the MBFC. Well, the ground, I'm not talking about the subterranean, right? That's, in fact, I walked through that recently. I give you my own experience, that I decided that I had a meeting at Price Waterhouse, and I decided to take a train there. So I worked out which station and got in there. My goodness, it was so difficult to find it. That was one of the problems going through. And the signage at the moment was very bad. They say MRT station. When I came down, I kept walking. I kept walking, and then it was a dead end. And then I got up, I found the nearest staircase to get up to the surface. And the MRT station was like about a block away. So I think there are some difficulty. Maybe, as I say, maybe it is not mature. Maybe you need time for that to happen. I can't get the first one.
It's about architecture and not being so subjective. It's a bigger statement.
Okay. I said that, I did say, and maybe I'm a non-architect, so I can say, I like this building or don't like this building, right? That's the level I'm talking about. But even architects disagree that whether something is architecturally aesthetic or not. And it can be controversial, I'm just saying. It's not a big point.
One of the best way to judge the significance of the design is whether it has accrued or created controversy around it.
I see.
So that if it does, historically it will stand up as a signature project. If it doesn't, lukewarm, eventually everybody forget about it.
Well, if that's the view, that's fine by me. Yeah, I'm no architect, and I would prefer things I liked. It doesn't matter whether it's controversial or not.
Can we have the next question? You just raise the hand and somebody will pass the mic to you. All right.
Dr. Seek and Mr. Sin, sorry, it's not one. I got 3 comments to make, and it's all interrelated to some of the comments and growth trends that Dr. Seek mentioned just now. I think if we look at this whole land sale process, and especially in expanding its reach into other areas like master planning and so on, then I think we forgot to look at one very important aspect which is totally missing, which often is the taxation part. Now we can appreciate that all these years our taxation rules have developed to deal with the changing landscape, different kinds of competition and control measures, but yet if you want to look at tapping on the capital markets, deepening the involvement of the capital markets in such areas, then I think we are a little bit of a pulling in different directions where our tax authorities are looking at a more punitive and control perspective rather than encouraging bona fide investment that can come in at different times of the life cycle of a project. And especially in the master planning project where it comes in phases, then I think we really need to look at it in totality. But unfortunately, I do empathize with our fellow practitioners that the URA sometimes acts only more as a sales agent in a facilitator of the first part only, but not so much the financial part of the whole project equation. Now, secondly, it's also this thing about in the dual envelope system, although different versions have been given, but the general impression that developers have you perceived now is that it is always a case of just pass or fail. How well you really do, how well you score in a design, at the end of the day, when you open the second envelope, is almost redundant because whether you're first, second, or third, it doesn't matter. It's still the highest price that wins. And I fully appreciate that we need to award to the highest bidder in the end, but perhaps there could be a differentiation of sorts, like you do score like maybe 50% on point system, not just a pass and fail. Because like you say, it is subjective. At the end of the day, when you open up a design, nowadays it's not just a drawn design, but there's music, there's a video involved, it's emotive. What's a brand name, who are the architects involved, who are the business operators. Different things appeal to the panel, right? So to me, the subjective element has expanded in spectrum. And thirdly, I think I very much applaud the planning authority's efforts in recent years to include a lot of non-commercial real estate, bus interchange, hawker centers, healthcare centers, childcare centers. And especially, I think this will have a lot more application in the scope of master planning. But when we do this, we must bear in mind that the approval of the planning system is a lot longer. So whether is it the time to market or the period allowed for sale, I think to be fair, to be encouraging to the developer, to the investors, I think the timing must be given some consideration. And when the market gets overheated, when control measures comes in, you often put these long-term developers in a bit of unfair disadvantage because theirs was longer to hit the market, not because of by their choice, but because of by the complexity of the product. But yet no differentiation is given to that kind of thing. Yeah. Thanks for bearing my long comments. Thank you.
Thank you. I think the last question should be answered by someone from URA. I really don't know enough about how URA's process and procedures and criteria that they use to be able to answer those two questions at the end. All I can say is that, yes, for developer, timing is money. Time is money. The longer it takes, the higher the cost to them. So it would help to be able to expedite approvals and whatever things that are required. So that's a general point I can make. The question about tax, I think you can argue bigger globally that, in fact, the tax system in Singapore, at least the direct taxes, that are much more are simpler, and we are not a very high tax country in that sense. Are you talking about property taxes? Oh, stamp duties. Stamp duties are introduced for reason you know, right? Yeah. So I think, I mean, we all have different views on it. I think, as I said, that sometimes to play God is not so easy. When you switch on and switch off the market, right? But if you don't do it as a responsible government, and if the market should go bust as a result, and we have a lot of people in trouble, how would you feel when that happens? So I think it's just a difficult choice of that. I would say that this government is much more proactive in this area.
I'm supposed to be the moderator for this session. But maybe just a very small comment for the part where I think in recent sales sites we have, you're right, included things like bus interchange, childcare center, CC, and so on. So longer time to build, you would know, yes, longer time to build, 7 years, 6 years, more than the normal 5 years. But longer time to sell the condo units is a different story. So I think all I can say is that if you need more time to build, I think we are much more flexible. But on the time to sell, there's reasons why it's restricted, it's deliberate. Yeah. We can talk later. Yeah, this is something that I've heard before from many developers. Can we have the next question?
Dr. Seek, excellent for the audience, excellent presentation. Thank you very much. This is a bit of a plug also for the Urban Land Institute, if I can say so, that we've been involved with some elements of this in terms of the input. And we're very proud to be part of this and working with URA for the Jurong Lake District master planning and the input, which was an interesting exercise in itself. Aside from that, just looking at it from credit where credit is due, personally from an urban economist as well as a planner, architect, investor, developer, now a capital markets manager at the moment, I've got to hand it to URA and the Singapore government for the urban economic side of it in terms of being able to make money out of land. I mean, there's probably no one that's been able to balance and be able to say confidently that the ability to plan, execute, and make money out of land has been better demonstrated anywhere in the world. So my hat off to the Urban Redevelopment Authority and all the other agencies and departments, ministries, and what have you. I would, however, like to touch on this point. I know it was a little bit sensitive insofar as the element of release of control. So what is it, Dr. Seek, do you believe it would be the real catalyst for the release of the control, the ability for the private sector to take more control? What is it in particular that you would advise the government in this case?
I think I've said throughout the presentation that one theme that I was trying to put forward is that if you compare to how PPP is done in a few other countries, certainly the PPP there have much more private participation, and that it seems to me that the private sectors there are more willing and more able to participate. Now, why don't we see this here? So what is it that is preventing that from happening? I think it's a case, we have built up a system where it is very prescriptive in approach. And that it may be because the private sector here is getting used to that, waiting for instructions to do things. Right? And that has to change if we want to tap on the innovations and the new ideas. Like, well, what is the next thing the government going to do? We'll just follow. You know? We won't get wrong. We will be okay. So I think that is it's something not very tangible that I'm talking about, but therefore much more difficult to achieve, I think. Whereas if you say, oh, you know, I have this, want to build this building or this road, that's easy, that's a very definite thing to do. But this is about changing the way we do things and the basic philosophy and the culture behind it. So I think it's got to be both ways. But I see some positive signs happening, right, as I mentioned before. You're going to...
Can I make a comment? I think it's a great talk, Dr. Seek, and you captured the history fairly accurately, except one little point, and I have to make that little point because of the man sitting next to me. You said the early sales, the quality was not good. True,
The
I think
buildings,
true
the
for the
buildings.
very early sales, I think. This man can correct me. But I think you left out one important aspect, which is that a lot of emphasis, maybe after the immediate early sales, but probably late 60s, early 70s, tremendous emphasis on design. And I think that emphasis on design, not just price, but design, and I won't go into the details of how that was decided because there was also a little bit of controversy, but because of that emphasis on design at the very early stage of building our city, we got projects like the Gateway in Beach Road, the Paul Rudolph's Concourse, OCBC Center, and of course our own local architects, now very much in the newspapers, People's Park Complex, Golden Mile Tower, Pearl Bank. So these were all products of the early sale sites, and I think the man responsible, really, I would call him the father of urban renewal in Singapore. My first boss in URA, he was the head of urban renewal department, and the one who really started all this public-private partnership in urban renewal. I think he can tell me, correct me also if I'm wrong, but I think that emphasis on design in the early stages of our urban development, I think it was a very, very strong impetus to really shape, I think, the kind of design influence on how Singapore has developed. I think not enough credit has been given to that. Those early days where, although we were still a young city, there was so much emphasis on quality developments and quality projects. So, Mr. Alan Cho, you might want to add on.
Let me just say this, that I agree totally. Maybe I should have qualified and said many.
It's okay, I think you were just trying
many
to...
of them were really substandard. And you
want to add on? He's
That's
very modest.
why when Alan appeared, I started to have some worries about what should I be.
Hi, my name is Sunny Tan. Dr. Sid, could I ask, in the capacity, I'm a part-time adjunct trainer at Civil Service College. And we have a lot of people from the surrounding country, government officials normally come to Singapore for training and learning our experience under the Temasek Foundation's sponsorship. And one of the key topics normally they come to study is this issue PPP. And inevitably, those countries that send their officials here to learn about so-called our Singapore PPP experience, these are from less developed countries, all the Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, and ASEAN countries. And the starting point for their interest is because these countries are at the developmental stage. Government want to do a lot of things but don't have money. That is the driving force for them to do PPP. But in Singapore's context, at today's status, we don't really need the money from the private sector for any joint PPP project. So can we say that the time has come where the driving force for PPP in Singapore should be perhaps, as you see, Dr. Sid, it can be smaller projects with the purpose of helping entrepreneurs, private sector, to build up the capability that go regional worldwide by government working with them. I don't need your capital, but I want to give opportunity to build a capability from small entrepreneurs, small projects to big projects where they can go global in terms of capability. That's my question.
Okay, I think as I mentioned earlier on, I think it's pretty clear that the public sector has been played the dominant role in any public-private projects. And for good reasons. And that's why we have the quality of the urban development here in Singapore. And that's why all these participants from other parts of the world are coming here to learn from us. But I think we have reached a stage in our development which I think if we want to move forward to the next stage of development, given how the world has changed and how new ideas need to be used, we need to allow more participation from the public sector. We got to believe in the public sector a little bit more than in the past. Right? So I'm not saying, I'm not a believer that we should help our private sector experiment with something with government helped. I think significant project like healthcare project and other things, we should be picking people, private sector people who we know can deliver, to be able to then transfer the responsibility to them in a sense. Right? But if we start saying, oh, let's try this one, try that, I think we might be in for a bit of a trouble. If we do that, things fails and they say, oh yeah, there you are. You know, we shouldn't have done this because the private sector screw it up. So I think, of course, there's a lot of, it's very simple for me to say this. I'm sure a lot of work needs to be thought through and to be able then to implement. But the general point I'm trying to make is that it is not a case of what, you know, the past 50 years has been great for us. The next 50, I think we've got to be much more up to the changing needs out there.
I think we only have time for one last question. The gentleman over there. Yeah.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ishin. I'm from Capital Land. Thank you very much, Dr. Seek, for an extremely interesting talk. I think many of the developers in the room will probably agree with you with many of the points that you made. My question is about the alignment of incentives that you talked about that is essential to the success of PPPs. I think it's fair to say, at least anecdotally in Singapore, there are perhaps a slightly mixed reputation for PPPs. I mean, I think Sports Hub is a quite prominent example where perhaps there were quite a few learning points. But in other areas like public utilities, I think PPP has delivered very strong results, perhaps because the deliverables are much clearer, are much more commodifiable, and therefore the PPP model has delivered very strong results. In the area of real estate, where perhaps sometimes the government objectives may change over time or may not exactly be so tangible and so clear, perhaps you could elaborate a bit more in your experience overseas. What are some of the learning points to ensure, or if not ensure, at least better align the interests between the developers and the, or between the master developers and the government or the public sector in general for PPPs? Thank you.
Okay, well, first of all, let me say that our approach has always been sell the land at a fixed price, or we help you deflate the price of the risk of it. So it is really based, I mean, and what we have introduced on design requirement is a good thing to align interests. But what I find we try not to do, and we have not done it, is on profit sharing. So if you are a long-term projects, and if the two partners are sharing profit over a long period, their interests are much better aligned. So, and this is not uncommon. Like when the example that I gave recently to Choi Chan Fong when he put the is that some of you will know the Queen Victoria building in Sydney, which is a thriving shopping center at the moment. It's a very old building, beautifully built 200 years ago or so. I can't remember exactly, but a long time ago. It got totally run down. And so a foreign developer came in, actually it's a Malaysian developer came in and offered to restore it to what it was and turn it into a shopping center. It was a roaring success. And the arrangement was that the city government, which owns that and still owns it, that after a certain period of time, they get to share the revenue. I cannot remember the split, whether it's 50-50. So the idea is that the developer will get back its money, right, its investment, and then beyond that, the revenue gets split. So that ensures that the developer did a good job about turning this thing around and making it viable, and for the government to keep an eye on it to make sure that the revenue is generating the way it should be. So there's tremendous alignment of interest in that case. But I think we tend to shy away from this. This is not a new idea. I mean, there are many permutations of this. I'm just giving you one. That it's a way to align, but maybe because the URA is not set up to manage income-producing assets over time. Right? It's a hassle to do that. It's much easier to say we sell the line clean, you build it, and then you produce what you have. Maybe, you know, that it requires a bit of rethinking.
We've come to the end of the event, so thank you for your questions. Please join me to show our appreciation to Dr. Seek by giving him a big round of applause.